Morning, Professor Barnes. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to chat to us this morning. The aim of this interview is just to gain a simple insight into the experiences of practicing researchers in the field of psychology. I understand that your qualifications include a master's degree from the University of Natal and a PhD in public health from the University of the Witwatersrand. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, yeah.
Could you discuss briefly what led you to pursue the study of psychology and more specifically to become interested in practicing research?
Yeah. Well, at the beginning of my undergraduate career, I had no idea what to do. I actually selected all my subjects with a GY at the end and hoped for the best. So I started my undergrad at UCT in 1994, and that didn't work out. Came back to my hometown, which was Pietermaritzburg in Natal, and then completed my BA there. And became interested in many things. I did, in keeping with my GY principle, did zoology and all sorts of things, but I managed to retain my interest in psychology, and I majored in psychology and sociology, which was eventually very fortunate for me because I thoroughly enjoyed both those subjects. Yeah. And then went on to do honours in psychology and research psychology masters. Yeah.
Why did you choose to go to UCT as opposed to studying in Pietermaritzburg?
I was desperate to get out of Pietermaritzburg.
Okay.
I was there for my entire life. It's a small, well, it feels like a small town. I just wanted to explore the world. But that just didn't work out. So I came back and then had a very good, I think, university career. I was particularly inspired by a lecturer who joined our campus from UCT, who really promoted research psychology. Kevin Durheim, who eventually became my master's supervisor, and he single-handedly converted many of us to becoming research psychologists.
During your study of the discipline, were there times you experienced any anxieties with regards to your career path, or doubted whether it was right for you?
Absolutely. Like many people, I guess, when you start studying, a professional degree, you have certain anxieties around getting jobs and so forth. But I think with research psychology, it was and still is marginalized within psychology, in the sense that many people don't know what it is, and you worry about all the way through what exactly is a research psychologist, what exactly do you do? And I think we're still having those debates currently, but I think there was some anxiety early on. Yeah. But that soon fell away as soon as I started working.
If someone were to ask you what is a research psychologist and what is their role, what response would you give them?
It's a good question and a very difficult question, because I think research psychology has evolved much quicker than what is currently advocated by the Health Professions Council. I think in the way I conceptualize it, and many people agree, the initial idea behind research psychology was research in service of psychology. Not necessarily research perhaps critical of psychology, or research research using psychological principles. And I think we have at the moment quite a bit of tension where the scope of practice, for example, really is pushing us to become research in service of. So if you can imagine a research psychologist designing psychometric tests and validating tests and so forth, that's the kind of idea that's being perpetuated. But in reality, what you have is an amazing, amazing set of people who have this wide variety of skills, who use those skills actually in a number of other disciplines, sectors, and so forth. And for me, that's the real appeal of research psychology that I like to call contemporary research psychology, where you are trained in research, you're trained in psychology, but you find employment in a number of sectors, and you do really good work, not necessarily in service of psychology, if that makes any sense.
Currently, you occupy the positions of Associate Professor and Deputy Head of School at the Community of Community and Development at the University of Wits, as well as research psychologist and public health researcher, and are an honorary research fellow in London. Could you elaborate on what these various positions entail and what they demand of you?
Sure. The associate professor I like to call my academic position. That's the position that I'm basically employed for here at the university. And that's essentially the three pillars, and that's teaching. So I teach health psychology and I teach research methods, third year and masters predominantly. I do a lot of administration, and of course I also do, not as much as I'd like to, but I do research. So that's the three things there, and that's the associate professor position. The deputy head of school position entails me primarily supporting the head of school. When she's not around, I act as head of school. But on a day-to-day basis, I'm predominantly responsible for a couple of key functions of the school. And the one that keeps me occupied the most is I'm the chair of the research committee of the school, which basically in a nutshell is responsible for oversight of research in the School of Human and Community Development. So that's the two positions at Wits. The other two positions I occupy are essentially honorary positions. So the position at London South Bank University in England entails me flying over to London once a year, and there I teach on a number of their master's programs. Together with colleagues there, we co-supervise PhD students, and we do a fair amount of writing. The last position is at the Manoff Group in the US, and that's also a similar position where I go over there occasionally to do research.
When you travel to London and you teach there, do you find that the approach to research is very different overseas to the way we approach it? Is it differently taught? Is it differently respected?
In different ways. I think that particular university, and it's partly why I like it, is very diverse. So you get students from Uzbekistan, as well as students from England, students from the US, and so forth. So it does have a strong international flavor. The essence of research is the same wherever you go. We struggle with the same issues on a day-to-day basis. I can easily use my slides I teach my third years or my masters and adapt them to slightly, but the essence is still the same. And I think that's part of the beauty of research, is that you can actually use the skills you've been taught in one context, but apply them to another. And but a key issue there, I think, is being able to see the bigger picture. And I think part of the problem in South Africa is that we still are so focused on understanding implications for South Africa. You know, so when people say my work is good, it's novel because it's the first in South Africa or the first in Wits. I'm always the first to say, well, listen, it's a big world out there. You know, surely your work has implications for other contexts. And I have a wonderful colleague who asks a question: what implications does your work have for a man sitting under a tree in Australia? And it's an odd question, I know, but there's some kind of structure, or there's a reason behind that particular question, and that's to be able to really think about what implications you have beyond Wits, beyond Joburg, beyond South Africa, and so forth. Yeah. So I guess that those are kind of the differences I see in terms of South Africa and perhaps the rest of the world.
What is for you the most valuable or best part of your job and your profession? What do you enjoy most when you wake up in the mornings and go to work?
There are no 2 days that are the same. I have, on one day I can be teaching a third year class who crap on me for not explaining something, and then I could be called up to the 11th floor where the Vice Chancellor craps on us for something that we've done. So there's no 2 similar days, no 2 days are alike. And it's challenging, but it's also immensely rewarding to be able to be in a great institution like this, to be in a job that I generally enjoy. And there's a lot of things. I think later I can talk about some of the highlights of my career.
Reviewing your extensive resume, including your numerous publications and conference proceedings, it's apparent that your research interests are concerned primarily with public and environmental health issues. Are there any factors in particular which fostered your interest in these fields, or these areas?
Yes, I think numerous factors came together. I've always been interested in impact, making an impact. And this is partly why I didn't want to do, for example, clinical psychology and so forth, because I wanted to just try and make a difference to many people's lives. And if you unpack, for example, health, which I'm interested in, and you look at the question of what is killing us, 30% of the global burden of disease is due to environmental factors. In many countries, 90% is due to environmental factors. Now, environmental factors don't mean necessarily conservation and biodiversity and so forth. It is the everyday environments that people are exposed to in their everyday lives. And here we're talking about the basics, a lack of water and sanitation, a lack of access to clean energy, a lack of adequate housing, chemicals in the environment, pollution in the environment, and so forth. So that really got me going, and I became very interested in a subdiscipline called environmental health. And I had a job at the Medical Research Council where I was tasked to basically do research in environmental health. And that initially stemmed or sparked my interest in that. So at the moment, what I'm predominantly interested in is in three things within that environment, health, and psychology. And the three things are, number one, to do more work looking at the impact of environment on psychological well-being and development. And I've done several studies in that regard, looking at, for example, children's exposure to lead in the environment and the impact it has on cognitive functioning. We've also done several studies looking at mercury as well as air pollution. And that's the one arm of my research. The second arm is intervention. So the question is, what do we do about it? What do we do about these things? And as a psychologist, I'm usually drawn into creating and designing interventions, but mostly behavior change interventions. But again, my job is to think about how we can do those better, but also more politically and critically inclined. Yeah. The third part is, of course, the critical part of it, where I stop often and think, what are we doing here? Yeah, as psychologists, what are we doing? Someone comes to ask me to design a hand washing campaign in a community where very little water exists, and what are we doing? What's at play here? There's some obvious things that happen in that regard. We are part of a global research knowledge economy that promotes those kinds of interventions. But every now and again, it's important to stop and reflect on what I call the politics of those particular kinds of behavior change interventions. So that's in a nutshell my research interest.
Obviously, a number of us here are probably aspiring researchers and are practicing some of our own research. And could you discuss, maybe in reference to one of your seminal works, what are some of the issues that arise from inception to completion of a research project? How do you go about doing it when you practice?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to remember post-university training is that in many instances you are not in control of a study. So as a researcher, it's very rare that you actually conceptualize a study and take it all the way through to publication. That happens in the academic world more often than in the real world. But remember too that in the way we think about research psychology, many people are going to find themselves in applied context. And it's about a number of softer skills to be able to determine what's going on, who the key role players are in, for example, what stage are you coming in the research process. In many instances, I'm called on to rescue projects because I've got the technical training and perhaps the experience. So a person who did a study and has messed up, basically, a funder or someone will call me and say, can we salvage this thing and make it relevant, for example, to the funders or the key stakeholders? those kinds of skills are really important. And in fact, your thematic content analysis and your factor analysis and all of that becomes actually quite minuscule when it comes to the real world of risk research. It's important to have those skills, but I think you learn a number of the softer things to be able to be a successful researcher.
What have been the highlights of your career this far?
Sure, there have been many highlights, and I can talk for a long time on that. I mean, I think the recognition from anybody is nice. You know, the research world can be quite brutal sometimes, where you on one day can have great reviews of an article, and another day you could have a scathing review, you know, saying this is the worst thing that anyone's ever read. But it's always nice to get recognition, and I have been very fortunate to win a couple of things, but the thing that stands out is the Friedel Cell Shop Award that I received from this university in recognition of the impact of my work. And it's a prestigious award. It's a 3-year award, and they only give it to 4 researchers in the whole university, so I was very happy to have received that. I've also, another highlight was, and continues to be, my work in other countries. I thoroughly enjoy that, and being invited to be part of big studies, for example, in India and Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda, England, by big funders like the Gates Foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I've worked for Carnegie and so forth. So that's also quite nice. And I've also been invited to give presentations in other countries as well. So the travel part and the global part is another highlight. But I think sort of on a day-to-day level, one of the things that really keeps me going is to see my students doing well. To see you yesterday receive the Chancellor's Award at the graduation was immensely satisfying to many people, but me included, knowing that, you know, perhaps I had small part to play in that. Last year, 2 of my students won several prizes in various university cross-faculty symposia. So that kind of thing, you know, to see them go on to have careers of their own, that's immensely satisfying to me.
I was actually just about to ask you about what it's like working with students and, you know, fostering their interest in research. It must be a very satisfying part of the job.
Absolutely. And it starts from trying to get them interested in research, because most psychology students who come through the department don't really see research psychology in particular as a very exciting career. We spend a lot of time converting them. But things are changing. Another highlight being at Wits was to be involved with an incredible team of people in the research psychology team, who in 2008 we had 5 applications for the program, and each year since then we've had more and more applications. Last year I think we exceeded 50 applications, and within those applications more and more people are choosing research psychology as their first choice. So that's also been very exciting. So yeah, I know it's immensely satisfying, challenging but satisfying. Yeah.
Talking about choice of research psychology as opposed to clinical or counselling, why do you think it is that so often clinical is sort of seen as the gold standard, especially, I don't know about other universities, but in Wits in particular?
I think it's pretty common in South Africa. I think it's historical. I think you know, we come from a legacy where that kind of training and that kind of thinking is strongly associated with psychology, period. And I'm sure many of you sitting here would have experienced this when you say, they ask you, what are you doing? You say, I'm a master's student in psychology. Ooh, you're going to read my mind. You know, that kind of thinking. There's very little understanding of what psychology is beyond that framework of clinical, of the kind of Frasier, remember the sitcom Frasier, on TV way of thinking. Yet we have a wonderful opportunity to reimagine what psychology is in this country, to redefine it. And I think conferences like this go a long way to doing that. Often, of course, we preach to the converted, but yeah, I think slowly but surely we're moving to a situation where psychology is seen as, especially professional psychology, is seen as belonging to different groups, not just the clinical, kind of, perhaps narrower perspective. And this is not to say, I've often been criticized and challenged when I talk about this, because people say, well, then, are you saying we don't need clinical psychology, or it's rubbish or whatever? And that's not the point. The point is that we desperately need clinical psychologists, we desperately need counseling psychologists, we desperately need research psychologists, and. It's about making the space available for them to identify with a particular career in that particular field.
What are some of the challenges you think an aspiring researcher faces, or the discipline as a whole faces?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. The first is a systemic one, and that is that in many instances, as a young researcher post-university, you are thrown in the deep end. We don't really, even in academia, we don't have the structures to be able to let people learn, particularly post-tertiary, the post-masters, for example, or post-doctoral period. I was, for example, thrown in the deep end. As soon as you leave university, you start doing research, you're responsible for big research projects, you have very little supervision and so forth, and it's very difficult. Again, it's the softer stuff that comes through that I spoke about earlier that becomes important in that regard. So yeah, there's a structural issue, and of course many people are talking about this, and there's much more talk, but also a lot more funding to be able to kind of guide people post-masters and post-PhD. For example, this university is emphasizing the postdoctoral system, the postdoctoral fellowships, which is an important part. People like me didn't have that. You were just straight from masters, straight from internship into big studies, and find your way yourself. So there's that aspect, and I think also in your career, very quickly, if you show promise, you get promoted quite quickly. I still consider myself actually an emerging researcher, yet I'm responsible for a lot of things from a research perspective in the university and so forth. So there's that aspect. The other particular challenge, and I find that I wish I had thought about this before starting a career in research, is to develop a bit of a thick skin. It's devastating to get that first negative review. It's devastating to get bad feedback or negative feedback from reviewers and so forth. But that's what it is. This is the nature of the game we're in. And you really do have to identify strategies, and people have very interesting strategies to deal with this. But take what you can from reviews, from feedback from supervisors and so forth. Use that, but also don't let it get you down. The third challenge, I think, and it's partly our fault as teachers, is to get research psychology students to not just think about methods. We're so focused on methods that sometimes we forget why we're actually using research or using those methods. And I see that a lot, where people will be able to critique a study at length because they use the wrong kind of analysis or something. But you forget why exactly you're doing the study in the first place. Right? And I think, those three things, if I could give any advice to a young researcher, that those three things would be it.
Just about to ask you what advice you give young researchers, but you've just covered that.
Sure.
So that's all I have prepared. Is there anything the floor would like to ask Professor Barnes?
I'd like to know, what do you mean by the softer stuff and the softer skills? What exactly?
There are many. The softer things, like I just explained, would be, for example, the ability to take feedback, negative feedback. It's all nice when you get good reviews, but there are many occasions when you get negative feedback, even during your postgraduate study, and you need to be able to take what you can from that. I've seen extreme cases of this where people have actually just given up and saying, I'm not cut out to be a researcher. You were never born to be a researcher. You were never born to be able to take good criticism or not. Do you know what I mean? That's stuff you learn, and that's important stuff. Other softer issues, for example, might be professionalism, being able to stick to deadlines, also to get along with people. Research, you often have to deal with people. You have to deal with people who manage research. You have to deal with field workers. You have to deal with participants. You have to deal with stakeholders who sit above you, the funders and so forth. And if you can't get along with people or don't see the value of, for example, other people's contribution, again, it's going to be a long and tough road. I mean, I can speak for a long time about the softer issues, but there's no course in how to get along with people. Do you know what I mean? There's no course about professionalism. We tell you to be on time and turn in your work on time, but it's very difficult to be able to teach someone things like that. You unfortunately have to learn that as you go along.
Yes, I've got quite a few questions.
No problem.
Firstly, I think I'd like to ask, what kind of person would you really say you are outside the professional world?
Outside the professional world?
Yes.
No, I mean, I think, I spend a lot of time on my family at the moment. I've got two, I'm married and I've got two lovely kids, and I do spend a lot of time with kids and young people. I'm talking 6-year-olds and 3-year-olds at the moment. So I spend a lot of time doing stuff like that. But generally, I think I'm pretty much the same out of university and in university. Approachable, I think. Ability to help people and so forth. But again, this links back to the earlier question on the softer things. Being able to, and one of the highlights too, Morgan, sorry I forgot to mention, is the friendships you make. It's so crucial. The people you meet, there's very few places, and I haven't even been in this game that long relative to other people, but there are very few places I don't have friends now. If I'm going to England, I have friends all met through work. If I go to Tanzania, I've got friends who have met through work. This conference, for example, Konzi, I've got Edward now, we've become very close, and that helps you so much, not because it's nice to be with him, but also you become colleagues, you think of ideas together, you might put in proposals, funding for proposals together. It comes to examining students' work, you help each other out, not unprofessionally, professionally of course, but those friendship networks play a role in it. And I think, coming back to your question, I think I tend to be a bit friendly sometimes.
I would like to ask about your background, the way you grew up. Do you think it influenced your interest in your career?
Absolutely, absolutely. In some profound ways, So I grew up in a small township really called Woodlands in Pietermaritzburg, and also poverty-stricken during the days of apartheid. It was awful, and always got a sense of the inequality that was going around. I recently had to give a talk about that to a group of young researchers, this very topic, and there were two things that really bother me in life: is inequality, and the other is when it's related, freedom is impinged, the freedom to do all sorts of things, their right to do all sorts of things. And that's a key feature throughout my career and perhaps my personality. If you do want to see a bad side of me, tell me what to do rather than ask me. You'll see me being a bit nasty, do you know what I mean? But those principles are the same. If I see any kind of injustice, and this drives me. I can't see, for example, health psychology is great at teaching people about the psychology of food. Yet every year, I've taught some of you, every year in my class I ask, how many of you in the afternoon session, how many of you have had lunch? And only a third put their hands up. Now that to me is a problem. How can we talk about the psychology of eating when we have a massive food insecurity problem? 16,000 children go to bed hungry every night in Johannesburg. How can we be? Do you see what I mean? It's this idea of relevance and the match. It's the same with hand washing. Hand washing is now the in thing in health psychology. Massive funding for hand washing. How on earth can we sleep at night knowing that that's the only solution we have when 20% of our population in South Africa don't have access to clean water? And even within that, the price for the poor is actually per unit is higher than what government sells to agriculture and to big industry. Do you see what I mean? That's injustice right there. You don't need to be a rocket scientist or a fancy clinical psychologist to be able to see where the problems are. So those kind of bad things I get from my childhood, to be honest. Yeah.
On this question, I think I would like to use my case as an example, where growing up in a family where I want to be a psychologist, but then having younger siblings who are growing up also want to study further, and somehow the family, especially the parents, feeling that you've been studying forever and you're not getting to masters and all that. So like, what kind of advice would you give to those kind of students where the family is not patient enough for you to get where you want to get with younger siblings coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of pressure, and I appreciate you focusing on family, but there's a lot of pressure to hurry up with your university training and to get a job, and we know that. And the question is then how can we support students like that from a university level to be able to, for example, get bursaries, to be able to have a meaningful kind of postgraduate university career and so forth, and even retain them into professional training. The irony of psychology in South Africa, as you will see in this conference, here we have 650 students presenting, right? Or attending at least. A handful of those are only going to be a professional psychologist. How do we address this issue? And the pressures to leave university are immense. And so there are various programs at the moment to try and address that, but it's a tough one because one of the programs we're working with in the school, for example, the guest speaker, I think you heard him speak a few weeks ago, he said there's 3 challenges with university. The one is getting into university, the second is staying in university, and the third is getting out of university the right way, not leaving before you finish, but getting through the Great Hall. And it's a wonderful way to capture those 3 stages, So you in university, many other people in university, how do we keep people like you, retain you to the honours and the master's level when there are all these pressures? And finances are an important, integral part of that, but not the only part. Yeah, they're not the only part, but yeah. So I wish I had a straightforward answer. I wish I could say, well, tell your parents to just hang on, or your siblings, but it's much more complex than that, I know.
Yeah. I think this is my last question to all students out there. What do you think is the most important thing to keep in mind while going on in the psychology career?
I think there are a couple of things. The one is for students very on to realize that psychology is not just clinical psychology. It's not just now everyone's on about neuropsychology. It's not just about counseling psychology. There are many ways in which you can think about psychology and careers in psychology. And there's a place for many more people, So you find that a lot of students only apply for clin or counseling and then don't apply for anything else. I think that's silly. So practical advice, apply to as many programs as you want, as you can, I should say, as possible. And B, to also just open your mind. I often ask people when they come to talk to students, they say, what should I, clin, what are they looking for in the damn clin interview? And I'll say, I don't know what they're looking for. But my first question to them is, what's your plan B? I don't know what my plan B is. Think about it. Here's a whole range of options in terms of careers in psychology, not limited to that. So there's a lot. The obvious one is hard work. Also, you have to work hard. It's tough. It's tough to get to university. It gets tougher also as you progress, as you implied earlier in your question. There's lots more pressures. Not everyone has 6 or 7 years at their disposal to be able to finish a professional degree. It becomes tougher in that respect. Hard work is important, but also not just hard work, but also knowing when to dig deep. And I think I see that a lot in my career. I've seen students who achieve 90% marks all the way through the university careers, but who are burnt out and actually haven't learned much at the end of it. Do you know what I mean? Equally, I've seen the slackers who don't get anywhere. But I think somewhere like most people are normal, like me, who would think, okay, now I need to to catch a wake up, and then maybe just take my foot off the gas a little bit. And it's the same with work and so forth. Just to be able to identify when you do need to pull yourself up, or to, you know, not everyone's going to be 90% plus students, and it's important to remember that. Cool.
Thank you so much for your time. It's a very interesting discussion, and good luck with everything in the future.
Thank you, Morgan. Thank you, everyone.